it's not the dunk that he thinks it is to say, even, forgive the negative connotations of this word, but indoctrinated children can express Reformed theology accurate on terms of decree. Right, because they've been taught to speak in this particular way and believe that this is the truth.
Welcome back to The Provisionist Perspective, where we want you to be firmly convinced that Jesus loves everyone, Jesus died for everyone, and everyone can be saved. My name is Eric, and I am going to be reading from you today, discussing an article I wrote on the Soteriology 101 website. As you can see, Drew and I are apart, and while our hearts grow fonder for one another, I'm going to be filling in here, and I just picked recording time. You're going to see why the recording time here matters a little bit. We're going to be discussing a kind of hot button, a little bit of a hot discussion that is going on here, and that is still ongoing. And so this is the recording time I picked for myself. We went to the Texas State Fair yesterday. It was awesome. It's my wife's birthday weekend, and so we're kind of taking it easy this weekend. I took a long weekend and went on a Monday, that homeschool life though, to the Texas State Fair. And it's a rite of passage for us relatively new Texas natives. And so that was great fun. And it was an experience, to be sure, very different from the Orange County Fair that I am used to. Orange County Fair on steroids. They say that everything is bigger in Texas, and that is the least cliche that I have ever heard. Everything is bigger in Texas, including the state fair. Saw a 1,200-pound swine, a 1,200-pound hog. Saw the Clydesdale horses, the actual Budweiser Clydesdales, 2-ton horses. They're massive. They're beautiful. It was an amazing experience. So this is going to be kind of a live wire discussion that is happening right now that I was writing about. Got a little bit inspired, got a little bit of the academic, the intellectual juices flowing with responding to this criticism, which was, I think, kind of the point that our critic was trying to get us to. So mission accomplished a little bit. A bit of background here as I share my screen so we can go over the article together. This came from a criticism from a guy named Josh, and this is all kind of on a semi-public forum, so I'm going to call it, that's his real name. His real name is Josh. He wants us to respond to this. I don't think he's shy about this. And I hope that I do his criticism justice. He kind of was already intimated that I haven't, and I want to be fair and respond to that. There's a part of this that I will change if he shows me to be incorrect. But I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to catch us up on the state of the dialogue right now. It's taken a few steps forward, and I have a few things to say about it here. So I begin. The state
Am I
of
detracting from the seriousness here? Is this?
Oh, I'm literally recording right now. This is awesome. All of a sudden, your voice is in my head. Do you have like 30 minutes right now?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so excited. Oh my gosh. It was so hard for me to get up the motivation to do this by myself. And I was like 20 minutes behind. I'm like, I'm just going to hit record and start going. And you're here to rescue me. Okay, here we go. This is awesome.
Yay.
So I write, Drew is here to the rescue. I write, the state of the soteriological controversies online is a shambles. I thought I was going to have to do this without our banter. And now the banter is here. This is okay.
It's here.
It seems like most want to build brand recognition through gotcha, mudslinging, and memes. I like memes as much as the next guy, and they can be useful rhetorical tools. But when the dialogue never goes deeper, that is indicative of a wider problem. In the spirit of being the change you want to see, the following will be a continuation of a deeper than memes dialogue. It seems like my interlocutor, a Reformed fellow by the name of Josh, is likewise concerned by the shallow state of the present online discourse. Specifically, he's more concerned about the shallow state of provisionist online discourse, that we aren't responding to what is actually right. We're too pedestrian. We're not actually responding to what historical Orthodox Reformed theology is, according to him. We're not going to get bogged down into the mud of proving that. Maybe that's stuff later on down the road, like what is historical Reformed orthodoxy. That's kind of a whole other thing, right?
Right.
Whether or not Josh is right that what he is saying is historical Reformed orthodoxy is actually that's a whole nother question we're not even touching. What I wanted to write about and what I want to keep discussing here, because Drew, you're a part of this dialogue that is going on the Facebooks right now. And what I said earlier is that this is the timing of this recording isn't nefarious at all. It's just, this is what I'm recording and I hit record. And so I don't mean to leave anything out from what, Josh's criticism or what Chris Harris is saying. I'm not trying to leave anything out. It's just, this is the time that we're doing this. And so if I need to edit the blog or we need to come back and revisit this, that's okay. But yeah, he's concerned that we aren't being accurate. And what I'm going to do is I'm responding to something very specific here that I'm calling the Standard of Seriousness. It's a name I made up. Maybe it's a terrible name. I don't know.
That's one of my favorite things about your blog entries, Eric, is inevitably there will be a new term or something in there like catching clouds or something that gets my eyes. That's like in all caps. And I'm like, oh, this is a new thing. Standard of Seriousness.
I'm trying to make a thing.
I think we had one that was called the Transcendent Midas Touch.
Yes.
That was another one.
So yeah, I'm trying to use phrases to describe this idea. And I want to be, one of my things that I want to do, piggyback after I read this, is I want to be clear about what I mean by the Standard of Seriousness. Because it can be, I kind of made it up. So it can be not clear what I mean by it. So I want to clear up if there's any misunderstanding there. Okay, so here's Josh's criticism. Specifically, Josh's criticism is that Soteriology 101 only critiques a modern popular level Calvinism that does not accurately reflect historical confessional Reformed theology. This is what leads Calvinists to not take our criticism seriously and push back with the ever so frequent, "You don't understand Calvinism." Drew, do you have any idea how to say this verbally? I know how to type it. Is it like, "You don't understand Calvinism"? Is it like a robot voice? Or
just imagine the SpongeBob meme where he looks like a chicken, and it's like, "You don't understand Calvinism." Just picture that in your head for our
don't understand
listeners.
Calvinism. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
The idea behind this typing is that somebody is kind of being obtuse and robotic and just repeating a criticism just to say a criticism.
Yeah.
That it's just this canned answer that we hear all the time. His main criticism is summarized thusly. This is quoting Josh. As I said above, if this is confusing, just remember, as I'm sure you do, that standardized confessional Reformed orthodoxy and scholasticism are quite far from outside of the bounds of what soteriology intends to deal with. I'm probably adding some prepositions there, but he goes on. Their goal is not to deal with Reformed theology as such. So our goal, he's saying, is not to deal with Reformed theology as such, but only to address the modern popular figures and sometimes Calvin. Thus, people shouldn't make the mistake of thinking they deal with standardized confessional Reformed orthodoxy. So I go on here. Moving forward, I'm going to call Josh's criticism the Standard of Seriousness. That is, since Soteriology 101 does not intend to deal with standardized confessional Reformed orthodoxy, therefore our criticisms aren't all that serious. He's not making a value judgment, as he goes on to say, quoting, by saying this, I'm not saying whether or not I find Soteriology 101's treatment of even the modern mainstream Calvinism to be good or bad overall. So he's not saying you guys are bad at it.
It's interesting that he can't. I don't know Josh, and Josh, we've interacted a little bit in the groups just very briefly, but it's interesting that it seems like he can't even bring himself to say that he's properly representing modern mainstream Calvinism here.
I think he is objectively saying that he isn't. and that he thinks those guys, see, again, when you write a blog post like this, you're just like, I need to focus it and I can't get off the rails on all this stuff.
Yeah.
But I think what he is exactly saying is he doesn't think a guy like Piper is.
Well, I guess what I mean is,
okay,
even if he thinks that Piper or Sproul or MacArthur are outside of, the historical Reformed orthodoxy, scholastics, and so on, he also can't seem to admit. But Leighton does do a good job of critiquing modern mainstream Calvinism, which is properly represented by Piper. So
I see what you're saying. Yep, absolutely. So he isn't making any kind of value judgment there. He is merely claiming our criticisms are shallow and inaccurate. Hence the justified pushback he received. Like he says, and I quote, Reformed theology isn't an unknowable entity. You can address Reformed theology such that your comments bear on the tradition as a whole rather than strictly modern positions. This would disallow even the Calvinists with uniquely modern expressions of Reformed theology from accurately saying, you don't understand Calvinism. And I go on, our focus on strictly modern positions is what leads to this criticism. I just stated his criticism here. I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole of whether or not I think this is accurate or not. I actually don't think it is accurate at all. I don't think this is why that we're getting these pushback. I don't think he is accurately describing the motives of the glut of people who say you don't understand Calvinism.
Right. He's speaking from the perspective that he thinks that most people are saying you don't understand Calvinism because you're not addressing this particular thing. But we disagree that that's even remotely in the minds of most people who are telling him you don't understand Calvinism.
Yeah, that's not it at all. Again, I wanted to be very focused on this blog post and not get.
You just let me know if I take you off the rails. By the way, I'm just I'm kind of along for the ride. So
this is what we do. This is what we do. Drew. Right. I didn't want to get off on that, but in a dialogue like this, in a broadcast, it's easier to do. It's just like a 2-minute detour, and you can come back. But on a blog post, it can be very distracting to go off on these rabbit trails. But yeah, that's not it at all. That's not why they're saying you don't understand Calvinism. They're saying you don't understand Calvinism for a myriad of reasons, and I don't really think any of them have to do with because you're not addressing. Maybe that's why he's saying that. That's why I didn't want to impugn his criticism too much. I'm going to go after it enough anyway. Maybe that's why he's saying that, and that's fine. That's good enough. So the purpose of my pushback is this. What I hope to show in transferring this dialogue to a blog post, which allows for more flexibility in how I address the criticisms, is that Josh's standard of seriousness is irrational, overburdensome, and internally inconsistent. And I do hope to show those things here. Specifically, on the one hand, Josh is claiming that what Orthodox Reformed theology is objectively and apparently easily knowable. Yet, on the other hand, Josh claims this knowability is simply a matter of linguistic and historical evaluation and interpretation. Do you see the problem? Historical and linguistic evaluation are not that easy. When I asked him how I could know what Reformed theology is, he answered, the confessional literature of the Reformed churches understood in their literary and historical context. For example, the confessions, the decisions, canons, documents of the synods, etc. But like Drew, don't those require interpretation and evaluation?
Yeah.
Well, how do I know that Josh is interpreting and evaluating that historical literature accurately? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, this was one of the pushbacks that we got from, you've mentioned Chris Harris, on our R.C. Sproul episode. Was our criticism was Brother R.C. was saying that, if you don't affirm this specific statement in the Westminster Confession of Faith 3.1, that whatsoever God decrees is immutably prior to creation, will come to pass. I didn't quote that properly, but you get the point. We critique him for saying you're either a theist affirming this or you're an atheist and you disagree with it. And one of the things that Chris Harris wanted to point out to us in the comments and in some interactions is that actually there's a lot of intramural debate among Calvinists, as to whether libertarian freedom can be affirmed alongside this. And so even in these historical linguistic discussions that you're talking about, you're not addressing any single one monolithic thing. I just don't think that's accurate. Yeah.
And again, this is one of the things that would have been a rabbit trail that didn't go on, that I would like to revisit at some point, which was that somewhere along the line, as Josh and I were discussing this, he claimed that these scholastic Reformed theologians who were interpreting the confessions and writing treatises on the confessions, two of them specifically came to two almost opposite views. So, and on one of the most, not on a secondary issue, on one of the main issues, which is the issue of libertarian free will, they came to opposite conclusions. So how can I know what it requires interpretation and evaluation?
Yeah. And that's the exact challenge, because he's saying you can find out what this is. You're not critiquing this. And then so as soon as we say, hey, we're actually not determinists, and this is why we reject Calvinism, as is formulated in the Westminster Confession or whatever else, somebody else can be like, well, you don't understand Calvinism because there's this whole other school of thought over here that says this. And it's like, well, then we're not addressing that, right? Now we're having a different conversation. It's not about understanding Calvinism. It's about the various different schools of thought therein. So.
Right. And it seems to me, this is something that I've said a few times and I'll keep saying, is that it seems to me that they have legitimate beef with us, but then they also should have really legitimate beef with the ministries of Ligonier, Grace to You, and
Desiring
God, that you need to be on their forums telling them that they're not confessional Calvinists, historically Orthodox confessional Calvinists. Are you spending as much time doing that? I bet you're not. Like, screenshots or didn't happen. I don't think that that's happening. Yeah. And you're not having this robust internal debate. You're just saying to us that we're not addressing confessional Reformed theology without telling the guys we are addressing that they're not confessional Reformed Calvinists. So I just, there's a lot left out in the wind here. So Josh goes on, back to the article here. Josh repeats this claim about the confessions. He says, whenever you look at a confession to meaningfully consider it, you have to understand the language and categories in their historical context. Okay. So let's recap here, right? It isn't enough to understand and evaluate how contemporary Calvinists are reading and using the confessions. You have to understand the language and rational categories in their historical context. Now, I'm not even sure if this is true. I'm summarizing his position here, that it's not enough to just talk about contemporary Calvinists and how they are reading and using the confessions, the stuff that's actually really out there right now. You have to do the work of understanding it in the rational categories in their historical context. I'm not even sure that's true. If what Soteriology 101 is concerned about is the present Reformed hegemony in SBC academia and online, I don't even think that's true. We don't have to. It probably would help us. As I go on to say later, it might be a good study for us to do. Hence, I'm interested in this. Hence, I'm talking about it. Hence, I wrote a blog post about it. So it could be interesting, but that's not a prerequisite, is it?
And this, I don't want to belabor too much here because, we still have some ground to cover in this article, but doesn't this weaken his position in the sense that, and maybe I'm just hanging out with a different kind of Calvinist. Maybe I'm just rubbing elbows with a different kind of Reformed guy. I'm a pointy-headed fundamentalist Baptist guy, over here who's just give me the red or black letters and let's talk about it. And so generally that's how this soteriological conversation is, well, you just don't believe the Bible. We provisionists just don't believe the Bible. You just reject this. You never read Romans 9 or Ephesians 1 and so on. And so we're trying to engage with the biblical data and say, the Bible doesn't speak in these categories.
Right.
So, and then he wants to say, well, you have to understand the Reformed categories in historical context. And so it seems to me that your system is dependent on this extra biblical conversation as part of its foundation, or else you're not. Shouldn't we be able to, in other words, you think that this Bible passage means this? I don't think it means that because of these reasons in this context and so on. So that's not a valid critique because we're not engaging in the Reformed. It's just a rather strange. This seems to me to, from my perspective, to undermine the strength, the apparent strength of the Calvinistic systematic.
Haven't we been told? How many times have we been told that I'm a Calvinist because I read my Bible?
Right.
And now Josh seems to be. I'm sure that Josh believes that Calvinism is biblical, of course.
Right.
But he seems to be undermining that you can just read the Bible and find Calvinism thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying exactly.
Yeah. Well, okay. So let us summarize these requirements in bullet points. Back to the article here. In order for provisionists' criticisms of Reformed theology to be taken seriously, provisionists must, of course, we can all agree, right? We must understand the Bible in the language and categories in its historical context. Anyone who's trying to be a Bible teacher needs to do that, right? Then we need to understand the Reformed confessions in the languages and categories in their historical context, the confessions themselves. And then we also need to understand the theological development performed by the contemporary to the confessions and later Reformed theologians in their language and categories in their historical context. So
multi-layered.
It's this multi-layered thing. And let me just give you an example here. To catch a glimpse of what the third point means, this dialogue with Josh began when he cited the writings of some of these post-confession Reformed theologians for a definition of free will. He started the dialogue this way, saying, this is how you guys should define free will from a Reformed perspective. This is how the Reformed perspective historically has defined free will. Okay, and the point is, let's see how you do parsing out the lexical and grammatical use of English long past in these definitions. And I'm just going to read one of them. Okay, this is Franciscus Junius. Having said this, and I assume actually that this is translated from Latin. That's his name. There's some Latin right there. I think this is translated from Latin. Having said this, it should be possible to define free choice conveniently as the faculty of the discrete will, voluntas discreta, free from necessity, which by which a mind-gifted nature chooses one thing above another from the things which are known by the intellect, or choice facing one and the same thing, accepts it as being good or rejects it as being bad. How are you doing with the definitions of voluntas discreta? And another quote uses cona naturalis. Cona naturalis? Sure. Do you feel like you need a few years of reading historical theology in your free time after work to catch up? And then I ask this question. Is it rational, a rational standard, to hold that every provisionist who critiques Reformed theology online must first reach the knowledge level of a professional Reformed historian? This question from Chris Harris, as we will see, has been answered yes. And I just ask you, dear listener.
Dear listener.
Does that make sense? Is that rational? Is it a consistent standard that you also hold Reformed teachers to when they criticize Armenian theology or the Greek Orthodox? Is that what we should just go around doing knowledge tests on them when they make criticisms? I kind of see how that's the case. And now this is the part where I want to be clear about what I'm not saying. Okay. As if anticipating this follow-up, Josh pre-fired with, when you asked above, what you asked above could be applied to anything, and we could just be complete relativists. I'm sure you don't apply this in numerous other places in your life, but who's to say consistency is a mark of truth? No. I'm saying that there are many objective historical truths I would learn by doing the historical study that you suggest. The point is that the standard of seriousness that he is attempting to hold provisionists to is overburdensome, irrational, and inconsistent.
So when if I can interrupt, when he says what you asked above could be applied to anything, what is he talking about specifically there?
When I asked, yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for editing my article for me. Is it rational? I basically asked that question. Is it a rational standard to hold that every proficient who critiques Reformed theology online must first reach the knowledge level of Reformed? I basically asked that it's not rational. And what I kind of asked him was, how do I know that what you're saying is actually orthodox, historical, scholastic Reformed theology? How do I know what you're saying is actually it?
And his response of we could be complete relativists is
what he's saying is,
I'm sure you don't apply this in numerous other places in your life, but who's the second? So what he's saying is that we don't expect other people to not attain a certain level of knowledge before critiquing stuff in other areas of life.
He's saying that we could all go, but how do I know that you're saying that this is the way it really is? How do I know what conformed
that we could just throw up
orthodox Reformed theology is? He's just repeating, no, this is knowable. You don't get to just punt to relativism. And I'm not punting to relativism. That's not what it is. I'm saying that your standard, what I'm calling the standard of seriousness, is just irrational and inconsistent, overburdensome. The standard doesn't make any sense. And you're not being consistent with your own standard. And here's why. It's overburdensome because it disqualifies everyone except professional Reformed historians from ever writing a sentence in criticism of Reformed theology, lest they not be taken seriously. I can see how this would work in his favor, right? Yeah. That would work out great for him. And it's irrational because it's possible for a criticism against Reformed theology to be valid without the person having done PhD level study into Reformed theological history. This point is a little bit overlooked, and maybe I should have fleshed this out and repeated this more. But what does any of this have to do with whether or not an argument is valid? He is not doing any kind of work in dialogue to show that our criticisms are irrational or invalid. He's just saying they're invalid because of the criticizer's knowledge level.
And you'll go on to highlight that a little bit later on in the article, from what I understand, is that, it just, who cares?
Yeah. He says this in a rather blunt way, and I was thankful for him saying it that way because it was so clear what he meant. And it's inconsistent because he doesn't hold Reformed teachers to the same standard regarding like libertarian philosophy and the use of its jargon, or understanding the technical academic work of William Lane Craig, nor demand they engage with the likes of Alvin Plantinga, nor recount the entire history of the Greek Orthodox break with the Reformed Church. Like, nobody is saying, and he's not saying, that Piper can't talk about Calvinism before he talks about this other stuff. Nobody's saying that. And if I was to be like, you need to read Bill Craig's academic work on the nature of time before you can say that open theism is wrong, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. I started my dialogue, Josh, by admitting there's lots of things I don't know. And I go on to admit that my degree in MDiv is a professional, not academic degree. It's a professional degree. But here's the thing. I've done graduate level research. I know what it takes to fully grasp the concepts he is front loading into the I'll only take you seriously if you first study this with. And I think he takes issue with this, and we'll talk about that in a second. For the professionals, it would take years of PhD study to become versed as versed as he wants us to. For the layman, this would take longer years of free time study. And since the layman probably won't do languages, we'd still be relying on translations. Is the translator translating the Latin correctly? I hope so. Another thing that I'm not saying is that professionists have no burden at all to rightly understand Reformed theology. It's definitely not what I'm saying.
Right.
Nor am I saying that it would be a waste of time for provisionists to delve waist deep into historical development of Reformed orthodoxy. I'm sure there's much value there. What I am saying is that this cannot be a rationally expected down payment on engaging in the soteriological controversies.
Yeah, this reminds me of a conversation that I had the other day about some of the much deeper nuances of compatibilism in the philosophical circles. And I was having a conversation with this brother who's a compatibilist, and he brought up some things like Frankfurt examples and what was the other one? Consequence argument, some different things that you guys will be as equally as unfamiliar with as I am. And I confess as such. I said, you know what? I don't know as much about this as you do. And he said, well, if you don't know about this, then I don't know how to have a conversation with you about this. And I'm like, well, do you want to talk about it? You know, and the answer, as far as I understood, and I'm, you know, researching one of the things that he sent me was, no, read this. And that's no way to have a dialogue. It's just
right. And Josh isn't doing that either. He's not doing what Josh isn't doing. And I point this out in this article here. I go on to say this. But what Josh isn't doing is he isn't saying, hey, you guys should read this and you guys should learn about it because there's this depth of this stuff and these dialogues that went on in the historical development of Reformed theology where people disagreed on these things. And you should really read that to be really valuable. Now, let me show you how your treatment of the contemporary Reformed are wrong. And here's why your arguments are bad. And exactly what do you mean by this? I don't know. He's not doing any of that.
Meaning like actually saying, hey, listen, to go read this. This would help you to critique the perspective, but here, let me deal with the arguments that you're presenting.
Right. He's not attempting to understand. I don't think Josh understands provisionism. No, but what I mean is I haven't seen him address you can say that, oh, these Reformed theologians over here address on the back end how God can decree all things, and yet man can still be responsible. And I don't think the part of that, I don't think he understands. And I hope to get to this with him is, and you and I've had this dialogue. Once you say the first thing, you've lost us for the second thing, no matter what you say afterwards. You can spend 100 years hashing out within Reformed orthodoxy exactly what it means to say that God decrees all evil without being evil, that God decrees all things without being the author of sin. You can, that's great. You guys go do that. But you lost us at the first sentence, and you need to show us how any of that follows once you say the first thing.
Yeah. And that's the challenge, is that I found that in terms of talking about the rational consequences and logical deductions that you can make from these things to be pretty pointless because they are making that jump and it's not a problem for them in their minds. Whereas for us, we're like, you've lost us, we're gone. So it's just really hard to
if he wants us to engage with this intra-reform debate, he's going to have to first show us how it can be possible that man has responsibility if God has decreed all things. So he's going to need to like reach down a little bit and be like, no, come with me on this journey to where there's a Reformed theology guy, that a theologian that answers this for you. And here's what you're saying. And I understand what you're saying. And I understand your concern here, and come along this ride for me. Not, here, read this. And he isn't, to be fair, he isn't doing that. He isn't saying, here, read this. And then walking away. He's not like linking an article and walking away. But he is saying, you guys need to get this knowledge first before your criticisms are valid. Back to the article. There's two other aspects of this criticism I would like to address. And I hope to see how you can see how these interplay here. It seems axiomatic to me that every field of study comes with its own language, jargon, terms that those known only to the few who engage in the field, and they're developed and shared among the literate of that language. And this is broadly true about the soteriological controversies where words like regeneration and predestination are common, while outsiders may have been lost at the word soteriology. This is especially true of highly specialized field of study like Reformed historical orthodoxy or Reformed historical theology. Only those on the inside will readily understand the language being spoken. Josh rather tips his hand that his standard is that we must become fluent in that language before we can even talk about Calvinism. He intends to say that anyone on the outside can understand what the Reformed mean by decree, but he ends up actually claiming the opposite. Okay, so follow me here. He says, a response to the first part is too lengthy to explain here, but for now, I'll say that more basic terms, such as, example, decree, are still used properly in Reformed churches, such that even the children of the catechism class that I teach in my church could explain what the term means. So even children can understand this. Why don't you guys, right? People seeking ordination in Reformed churches are rigorously examined orally by their regional presbytery on these things, and they know them. But if you go back to my poll, no non-Calvinist in this group was able to answer correctly. Okay? Yet they use the term quite frequently. And both Calvinists that answer the question correctly are determinists. So different Calvinist expressions agree on that and other things. So he means to say...
Is he saying that only 2 Calvinists in the whole group answered the poll correctly?
Yes. That's how I understood it.
So out of the at least 24 Reformed members of our group, only 2 of them understand what they're talking about?
That's a good point that I missed. That's a good point that I didn't even catch that. Yeah, I think that's what he's implying. Yeah. So he means to say that it's simple, right? His point is that what is historical Reformed orthodoxy is just easily understood, right? He means to say that even children can understand what decree means, while adult provisionists apparently cannot. But this is not surprising to any first-generation immigrant. The first generation struggles to adopt the new language, and many never do. The second generation, their children who grew up in the new language, have no trouble at all and end up translating for their parents. So yes, children being catechized in Reformed churches rather proves my point that it's an internal language Josh is expecting outsiders to speak before he will entertain them. And by entertain them, I mean take them seriously, not before he'll even talk to them. He's talking to us just fine. Further, the second point he makes when he says that people seeking ordination in Reformed churches are rigorously examined orally by their regional presbytery on these things is a strong point in my favor here. A naturalized citizen is just as much a citizen of the country as the native. Josh is using the example of the ordination seeking Reformed as an example of the technical linguistic knowledge required of us for citizenry among the serious. Without realizing it, Josh is suggesting that we must become Reformed before we can critique Reformed theology. Does that make sense?
It's not the dunk that he thinks it is to say, even, forgive the negative connotations of this word, but indoctrinated children can express Reformed theology accurate on terms of decree. Right, because they've been taught to speak in this particular way and believe that this is the truth.
Right.
You know?
And I mean this positively, honestly. I mean this positively. The Presbyterians, specifically, are very good at passing their religion down to their children. Us, non-denominational conservative evangelicals and even Southern Baptists could learn a lot from them on that regard. But that's not a dunk if the outsiders can't speak that language, if the children do. That proves my point.
Yeah. Yeah.
This section is titled Double Standard. What follows is that this standard, of course, only goes in one direction. Notice that when Josh is lamenting that provisionists didn't know the historical Reformed definition of decree, what he's really claiming is that we couldn't identify the technical jargon of the catechism. That's not the point he's trying to make, but it's the point he ends up making. You guys couldn't identify the technical jargon of the catechism. Yeah, you're exactly. Because we're not Presbyterians. We're not Reformed.
And this is with respect to Brother Josh, this is to your point about this being irrational, is why would you expect someone who doesn't accept the historical Reformed categories that you have to speak in precisely the same way that you do, or you're just not going to take them seriously?
Right. I don't see how Josh doesn't see that. I think he is so steeped in it that he can't look outside of it. Not being able to identify the technical jargon of the catechism means you fail the standard of seriousness. Does that seem rational to you, dear listener? It doesn't matter to Josh if we understand the concept or see it in a different, perhaps unpreferred way. Josh isn't doing a deep dive into our language and jargon to see what we really mean. Josh does not hold himself to that standard. Josh goes on, and I quote him here. I'm not trying to say that you can't critique the modern expression, but it'd be helpful if you guys were more clear that this is your intention. Sometimes this gets confused. The traditionalist may think you're dealing with Reformed theology as such. The Calvinist, interesting that he made that dichotomy there. The Calvinist thinks you're misrepresenting. If you're concerned with truth, accuracy, and clarity, this would help you out.
And does Josh realize that in our circles, traditionalist means something different than what he means?
Maybe.
Because the traditionalist may think you're dealing with Reformed theology as such, is effectively interchangeable with provisionist because of the traditionalist statement of faith. So the point is that there's a lot of terms going on here, but it is interesting. He's making a point between traditionalist and Calvinist.
Right.
Yeah.
See, and he rather tips his hat here, right? He rather tips how he sees this here. See, we, as provisionists, have to make our intentions known to the satisfaction of the Reformed. See, right? The Reformed have this hegemony, right? They're the ones that are holding all the keys, and of course, obviously, right? And you have to meet them where they are first. That's how he sees it.
It comes off as we'll give the stamp of approval that you're addressing this particular thing, and now that we're all on the same page, we can move forward. And then
we're the standard bearers as to when a dialogue can happen.
And maybe that's not what he intended, but that's certainly what it comes off as,
Right. And his behavior is such that he is dialoguing with us, right? He is reaching down in a sense. He is in our group and is dialoguing with us. And so he's kind of getting down in the muck, right? And doing it to an extent that maybe others wouldn't. But as he's doing that, in his attempt to show that the you don't understand Calvinism criticism is valid, he's coming off like the Reformed don't have to understand our criticisms in their context, but that we have to understand their theology in their context. He doesn't have to use the jargon that we use, but we have to use theirs. Right? That they don't have to extend the charity that our criticisms are worth understanding and engaging with on their own merits, but we have to extend the charity of identifying the technical jargon of the catechism.
And it's interesting, we've said this multiple times here on this podcast, that I was listening to a live stream earlier today with Brother Layton, and somebody asked in the comments, who's actually been in our comment section as well, she asked the question, do you distinguish between the gospel and grace? And then his response was, that question doesn't make any sense to me because the gospel is gracious. Like, the good news of Jesus is a gift to us that he brings to our ear holes and our eye holes that he didn't have to. So you're speaking in a category that we reject. We're not thinking in terms of this category of spiritual, effectual grace and the gospel, the good news of Jesus is. And that's why we did the episode. The thumbnail says all information is spiritual. Why we, harmful ideas and why we refute them. It's not all information is spiritual. Like, it's not like this spiritually infused, gracious stuff.
Right.
And then this gospel, just information over here. So in that sense, there are so many different people that one of their main objections to us is, well, you're semi-Pelagian because you don't affirm XYZ thing. And that's like, okay, but we're completely off the Augustinianism, Pelagianism grid. So from our perspective, your criticism isn't even valid because we're not even acknowledging those categories that we believe made up. So.
Right. And he doesn't have to do that first. I'm not saying that Josh isn't willing to do that at all. I don't know. But he doesn't have to do that first, right? He doesn't have to show that he understands what Anabaptist, Greek Orthodox categories we're talking in, that we have some roots in those places, that we trace our historical roots through some of those threads and then through the thread of SBC traditionalism. He doesn't have to like kiss the ring and prove that
it's because we didn't win.
Well, that's the point. That's exactly right. We didn't win.
Yeah.
That's right. But they don't have to do that. No, going back to my article, no. First, we have to prove to the satisfaction of the Reformed that we're really concerned with truth, accuracy, and clarity by accurately relaying Reformed technical jargon. We have to prove our own innocence before the Calvinists will deign to take us seriously. Being a little bit snarky here, but I'm trying to show how this comes off to us. Right. How this comes off. Well, and part of this is true, right? What part of this is true is, well, you don't have the rich theological history that we do. And that's true, good on you. You don't have the robust historical scholarship of the past 400, 500 years. True, good on you. But what does that, and so I understand why the Reformed perspective is attractive. I get it. But what does that have to do with our criticisms? Why is that a rational prerequisite? So
that might take us off on a rabbit trail. You go ahead. It's an unformulated thought for another time.
Okay. Josh doesn't have to do that on our end, right? He's not steeped in the history of the Greek Orthodox and the Anabaptists. He doesn't know the ins and outs of E.Y. Mullen's theology. And you will notice I'm not demanding that of him. I'm not rebutting his criticism on the basis that he hasn't reached the prerequisite knowledge about our history. I'm going to return to this in a second. My suggestion to Josh would be this. If he wants to see more productive dialogue, then you don't understand Calvinism, then seek to understand our reasons for rejecting Reformed Soteriology and the arguments we're making on their own merits. If you discern we're responding to a form of Calvinism you don't subscribe to, then tell us how the Reformed sources we're reading are wrong and do not represent Calvinism. In other words, have that deeper dialogue instead of gatekeeping be the change you want to see. Let me return to that. And to his credit, he is doing that. The internet moves fast. It's been like 18 hours since I posted this, and he's responded to it and is promising a longer response. Now, when I said this, I want to respond to this is one of the things I want to respond to that has been a development since I posted this. I said he's not steeped in the history of the Greek Orthodox and the Anabaptists. He doesn't know the ins and outs of E.Y. Mullen's theology. And he said, yes, I do. He's saying, you claim that I don't know these things, but I actually do. Okay, fair enough. And if he shows me that he does, to my satisfaction, I'll change this. If he's like, no, I really do, and he kind of goes like, this is the history, that's fine. I'll change this. What my point is, though, is that we all kind of have these areas of expertise. We all have these areas that we're more steeped in and that we're more knowledgeable about. We don't expect that everyone has the same knowledge, or anyone that is on an opposite aisle of anything of our perspective knows that as much either. It's not. What my point is that it's not a prerequisite. And so if I've assumed incorrectly, I'll edit that out. If you're one of those guys that is just well learned about a dozen topics, and you can wax academically, not just a working knowledge or waxing poetically or whatever, but you can wax academically about several different disciplines, that's amazing. I applaud you. I'm not that guy. But my point is that it's not a prerequisite to be that guy to offer any kind of criticism on anything. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, you're basically just pointing out that, you got to be consistent on this. If you're not doing this on the other side, then why the double standard? Why is it that the provisionist has to engage in this sort of deep historical orthodox conversation? And it reminds me of that conversation that I just had recently on some of these deeper philosophical issues. This is about where theology, where rubber meets the road. Ideas have consequences. And most people, first of all, most people aren't in Soteriology 101 discussion group, discussing on the regular with people on Facebook about different soteriological nuances and different stuff. They're not writing blog articles and recording podcasts and stuff. This is for your, as I like to say, your average Christian normie to listen in and learn as we're learning and stuff. And so many of you out there are probably not even doing this, right? I have some friends that are just listening to this on their way to work, not having these conversations. And so then you add an extra layer of, well, you got to investigate all this stuff. Then we're not having a conversation as brothers and sisters in Christ. And I wonder, so this is kind of a fundamental, I think, maybe difference between how Josh and I view even Christendom. And maybe this is pointing back to my own sort of Anabaptist roots, is that I don't care what the magisterium says. I just don't care.
Right.
Give me the Bible. Let's talk about it. Right. You're just as capable of understanding the Bible as I do. If you can't show me your own beliefs from the pages of Scripture, then and I'm not saying that all of that stuff isn't useful and that it's not important. I plan to investigate some of this philosophical nuance and stuff, because I'm the type of person that wants to have answers and doesn't want to get stuck in the same conversation. So I'm like, I'm going to read up on this and then I'm going to think about this and come back to it. So I'm not saying that that's not useful, but I'm just saying that's generally not how the level that most people are interacting on. And it's kind of unreasonable to expect them to do that.
But the other thing is, and what I'm kind of mean to say too, is if you're a teacher or you're a scholar and you have this knowledge, whether you're a professional scholar or a layman and you're a deacon in your church and you teach your kids class, but man, you really love historical Reformed theology. You really love historical theology. You really love programming. you really love something that you do, and you're super steeped in it. Have my buddy Dan, who listens to this on occasion, is super into cryptocurrency. He's just really into it. Actually has a YouTube channel on it and everything. And if that's that's fantastic. But if you're talking to somebody who's not, you're a scholar, you're a teacher, you're knowledgeable, what those guys do is they figure out how to explain it to people who aren't.
Maybe instead, maybe we should be honored that he expects us to know these things. Maybe he thinks like, well, you are the people that should know these things, and so you can't talk about them unless XYZ thing. You know, this is
I guess, but then
Dr. Leighton
explain it to
Flowers.
me then. If
Right.
I'm not there and you think I should be, then bring me along instead of front loading it as a cost before you'll take me seriously. Now, I want to say something about this Standard of Seriousness title. So in response to one of his points about the Standard of Seriousness, and I think that he's kind of responding to that term, the Standard of Seriousness, what he says is, I'm not saying that you can't be taken seriously if you don't do specialized study in this particular field. And you don't quote me as saying that. I know I didn't quote you as saying that. That's not what the Standard of Seriousness means. Is that it's used to describe this phenomena where you think you don't understand Calvinism is a valid criticism, or you have to prove to me that you know this about Calvinism before you can avoid the you don't understand Calvinism criticism. I'm attempting to describe that phenomena. Maybe, and so I'm not necessarily saying the words you're saying. I'm not taking you seriously. You never said I'm not taking you seriously. You didn't say that. But if I don't know enough about Calvinism, according to your standard, then you aren't really taking any criticism I'm saying seriously, right? And you think that I have to prove to you that I'm sincere. Like you don't think that I'm sincere in my criticism of Reformed theology because I may not be, because you can't decide whether or not I'm concerned enough about truth, clarity, and accuracy, right? If there's another step I could take to prove to you that I sincerely care about truth, clarity, and accuracy. So maybe this should be called the standard of sincerity. Maybe standard of seriousness is a bad name. I don't know. Standard of sincerity. There's some innocence I have to prove to myself. That's what I'm trying to describe. And so you can respond to that about how you're not really saying that.
And this, yeah, if I can articulate your objection here a little bit differently as well, is it seems to me like Josh and other brothers and sisters like him that say this, you don't understand Calvinism. There's actually a meme out there with the Drake, where he's like this on one, and then he's pointing at the next one. And it has Leighton Flowers on one side, and it says, God ordains all sin. And it's like Drake's like, no. And then there's a picture of James White underneath of it, and it's like, God ordains all sin. And it's like, yeah. So there seems to be, from our perspective, that I can make a truth claim about Calvinism that is not couched in the historical and theological nuance that the Calvinist would add and prefer. And he knows that when I say, or when Brother Leighton says, God has ordained all sin, that he means, and the logical conclusion of that is that God is the author of all sin. Therefore, nope, that's not accurate. And I think that, for instance, one common occurrence of this, you don't understand Calvinism, or people's irritation with specifically Brother Leighton, and maybe people like us, is where he says things like, well, either Calvinism is true and God has predetermined that I'm not a Calvinist, that I'm a provisionist, or I just have, studied these issues and a majority of Christians have good discernment and they reject Calvinism. So either God has predestined it or they have good discernment. And then they say, oh, I'm so sick and tired of Leighton saying, God predestined me to be a Calvinist, or to not be a Calvinist and stuff like that. Meanwhile, Guillaume Bignon, a French philosopher, theologian, he says in a broadcast with another Calvinist, as he asked him, Eli Ayala asked him, so is it true on determinism that God has determined that people like Leighton Flowers are not Calvinists? And he says, yes, determinism entails that God has determined everything. And so that includes that Leighton, is not a Calvinist. And so Guillaume Bignon, he can say it, but as soon as Leighton says it, it's like, no, that's not sincere. You don't meet the standard of seriousness because you're not speaking of this in the way that we would speak of this. So and as you pointed out quite aptly in this article, Eric, is that he tips his hand a bit, and whether he intentionally does this, I don't think that he does, but it's almost like you have to become a Calvinist in order to understand Calvinism, which is the point that he inadvertently makes with indoctrinated children can articulate this correctly and you can't.
Indoctrinated children and ordination seeking Reformed adults.
Right. Yeah.
So we have to become Reformed almost. And I think that's what it is. I asked him, now again, this was hyper focused on this particular, or responding to this criticism. There's other aspects of this that Josh and I have been bouncing around, and I want to get to them. And I actually mentioned to him that, Flowers yuck yuck, I guess God determined me to misunderstand him thing. I guess God determined me to be a Calvinist then, yuck yuck. And it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing. I get why it's annoying to hear. I understand that completely. But I just would like to be shown how it's inaccurate. You can be annoyed with it all you want, and when Flowers says it with a kind of a smirk and a wink, and I get why that's annoying. But I directly asked him, "Isn't that true then? Isn't true that when he says that he's right, and right means accurately describes one side of a historical intra-reform debate that has won the contemporary majority position." Like, if Josh is saying that there's a contemporary majority position in Reformed theology that traces itself back to some ancient, some historical Reformed disagreement, and it has won the day and rules today and may not rule in 10 years or 20 years, but it rules now, how is that not a valid thing to critique then? I need to respond to this in depth. I didn't get a good response from this question. I don't think. So that's the thing. Now, where this dialogue stands is this. Chris Harris, who promoted Josh to us and who posted about this article and responded to it, he says this: when I ask the question, is it a rational standard to hold every provisionist who critiques Reformed theology online must first reach the knowledge level of a professional Reformed historian? When I asked that question, he said, anyone who attempts to engage at the academic level ought to have a good understanding of what the framers of the confessions intended. Sure, especially if they have a master's level or doctorate level education. Okay. And here's what I wrote. And this is the kind of where this stands as of right now. I think you're actually factually incorrect here, because I'm doing the, well, actually guy. I'm being that guy right now. Actually, a master's is not an academic degree. An MDiv, neither an MDiv, my degree, or a DMin, Dr. Flowers' degree, is an academic degree. That's not a secret. No one's trying to hide the fact that I don't have an academic degree. Dr. Flowers doesn't have an academic degree. It's a professional degree. Those are for practitioners.
Yeah.
So when you say engage in academic level, already you've proved my point. That's not what this is. an academic level is not, I go on to say that the academic level is not producing podcast content, nor writing blog posts. And so I guess his answer to the question above, that only provisionists who have reached done enough study to qualify as professional Reformed historians, is a resounding yes. You have to basically reach that knowledge level of a professional Reformed historian. And Josh goes, this is true, but it wasn't even my point. So he responds to this, Josh responds to this and says, this is true, but it wasn't even his point. I'll risk putting words in his mouth a little bit. I think what Josh is trying to say, and I would love to hear a response to this. I think what Josh is trying to say is that, okay, yeah, but it's objective. You can objectively understand what historical Reformed orthodoxy is. Even kids who can do it, anybody can do it. So it's not hard, and it's fine. You can do it. Not that you have to reach some academic level. You have to reach some sort of professional level. He says that's true, but that wasn't his point. So I guess all I can do is state that. All I can do is say is that until I'm told otherwise here, that Josh's standard is that only provisionists who have reached enough study to qualify as a professional Reformed theologian, a professional Reformed historian, can do away with the criticism of you don't understand Calvinism. I guess all I have to do is state that position in order to refute it. That is ridiculous, in my opinion. In my view, that is absurd, that this is the level. It is a standard nobody holds anyone else to. And I can see how that standard would work in your favor, but it just seems completely ridiculous to me. Are my arguments bad or good? Is the criticism bad or good? And I'm not going to disqualify you from bringing in Helm and talking about these Reformed historical figures and how they address what I'm saying. Bring it on. Bring these guys in and tell me how they address what I'm saying. But you'll at least be addressing what I'm saying.
Rather than the hand-waving dismissal.
Rather than gatekeeping.
Yeah.
You haven't reached the standard. Now, again, to be fair, Josh seems to be saying, that's not what I mean. I don't mean you haven't reached the standard. Like he goes on to say, you can have certain levels of true knowledge of something without grasping the finer aspects of systematics. I would never say otherwise. I don't know how. So he acknowledges that there are different knowledge levels, but I don't see how that responds to my criticism. And so I'll wait. But I'll wait. I'll revisit this. I'll edit this blog article. But until then, this seems valid to me, a valid pushback on him, that you're front loading all of this, you're gatekeeping here, and it's not going to get anybody anywhere because nobody holds themselves to the standard.